Dr. Gayer, because the interagency working group ignored Office of Management and Budget guidelines and used a global perspective in determining the SCC, agencies issue regulations with substantial domestic costs based on benefits to non-Americans. In what way does this this global perspective method of calculating the SCC potentially mislead the public?
So I'll answer in two parts. First, the models that are discussed here today are global models, so it's inordinately difficult for them to come up with domestic estimates. But the interagency review, interagency process did kind of benchmark it to 4 to 14 times differential. So the domestic benefits are 1/4 to 1/14 what the global benefits are based on the models that they use. And just to clarify, based on comment earlier, I think the approach should be taken if it is going to use a global measure. It's not a 0-1, right? You could use a domestic measure, or you can use a full global measure. Michael referred to straining credibility to assume that there's no global benefits. I think it strains credibility to suggest that there's going to be full global benefits, meaning if we act, the rest of the world will act instantaneously as well. So to the extent that that doesn't happen and we're using a domestic measure, we're overestimating the benefits. And the example I gave with the Clean Power Plan, on the climate benefits side, it's enough to tip the scales that the costs outweigh the benefits.
And Dr. Gayer, just to follow up, do agencies have a duty to inform the American public of the domestic benefits and the cost-benefit analysis for federal regulations?
Yes, and those are the OMB guidelines. As I suggested at the end, I think I'd be less kind of worked up over it if they did both, but they should lead with the domestic measure.
Dr. Dayaratna, what are your biggest concerns about using the SEC in policymaking?
Okay. Thank you for the question, Congressman. So there are a variety of issues with these SECs, with these IAMs associated with these SECs. The most fundamental issue is that they're extremely sensitive to very, very reasonable changes in assumptions. As I was referring to, using the time horizon to 300 years, if you shift that to 150 years, which is still unrealistic, you get a drastically different estimate of the SEC. The discount rate, if you use a 7% discount rate as mandated by the OMB, under the fund model, you will get a negative social cost of carbon. And the policy implication there would be that we shouldn't be taxing carbon dioxide emissions, but subsidizing it. Then lastly, with the equilibrium climate sensitivity distributions, the ECS distribution used was published 10 years ago, and it's not even based on empirical research. More up-to-date ECS distributions also will result in a substantially lower and even potentially negative SCC, depending on the model that you use. So with these results all over the map, I do not understand how policymakers can garner any meaningful advice for regulatory policy.
So just for the laymen who are here, what does the negative value of SEC connote? I mean, what are we really saying there when we say negative value?
Basically, in a nutshell, in general, when people think of SCC, they talk about economic damages associated with carbon dioxide emissions. When those damages are negative, that implies that the SCC actually provides benefits. And the result of that is, mostly increased photosynthesis, agriculture, and so forth. But that would suggest that increased CO2 is actually good for the planet.
Thank you. Dr. Michaels, in 2015, the Interagency Working Group released a report to the public comments on the determination of the social cost of carbon. You were one of the commenters. What is the significance of having a comment period in the process of developing an SCC, and did the Interagency Group adopt any of these comments?
No, they did not. And many of the comments were well-reasoned based upon recent peer-reviewed literature reinforcing the notion that the sensitivity of temperature that was used in the models was too high. Nature is trying to tell us something. If you look at that satellite image that I showed earlier, you can see that the observed warming in the lower atmosphere was about half of what was predicted. If you look in the tropics, you can see that the observed warming in the vertical in the tropics is about half, actually maybe even a little bit less than what was predicted. All these things point to a consistent story. About twice as much warming was predicted as is going to occur. Now, the UN's mean sensitivity is 3.2 degrees Celsius. Why don't we settle this out at 1.6? And everybody can go home, because we're going to meet the 2-degree guideline with business as usual, declare victory, and let's go on.
So when the report refused to adopt any of the comments, what does it say to the validity of the report and its objectivity?
I would say that they were wedded to a point of view, and I understand. I live in Washington. I understand the pressures in this town. If anyone gave an official answer that this was not a problem, I hate to say, we probably wouldn't be chatting here so amiably because nobody would care.
Thank you, Dr. Michaels. I recognize Ranking Member Bonamici for questions.